Okay. All right. So when an object moves or when you speak, what you're causing the air particles to compress. This forms sound waves. All right. Sound waves are then going to travel and be collected. So they're collected by this structure of the external ear called the auricle or pinna. So you can call it either or. And it looks like a funnel, right? So if you did not have this portion of your ear, you would have difficulty funneling sound waves into the middle ear cavity. All right, so the auricle or pinna collects and funnels the sound waves into the external acoustic meatus. Those sound waves then hit on the tympanic membrane right here. And so when the tympanic membrane, when the sound waves hit the tympanic membrane, it causes vibrations. The tympanic membrane is going to be the structure that separates the external ear from the middle ear cavity. And it is a cavity filled with air. When the tympanic membrane vibrates, it vibrates the first ossicle called the malleus. The malleus in turn vibrates the incus, and then the incus in turn vibrates the stapes. And the stapes is attached to the inner ear at the oval window. The ossicles serve two main functions. It connects the external and the inner ears together. So it's going to transfer the vibrations into the inner ear. And they also they act as a lever system, and they help amplify the sound as well. Because once it's transferred from the middle ear cavity into the inner ear, it's got to move through fluid, and it's more difficult to move through fluid than it is through air. So the ossicles help amplify the sound. I'm going to point out, so here's the middle ear cavity right here. It'd be filled with air. This cavity back here, this is called the pharyngotympanic tube. I like calling it the pharyngotympanic tube. You can also call it the eustachian tube. Pharyngotympanic helps give me like an identifier because it's between the pharynx and the tympanic cavity or the tympanic membrane, right? So it connects the middle ear cavity with the throat, and that's how you can equalize pressure within the middle ear. So now let's go into the inner ear. Stapes vibrates. That's going to act as a piston, and it's going to plunge into the oval window. When that stapes plunges into the oval window, it causes fluid in the inner ear to move. When that fluid moves, it's going to move all throughout this structure called the cochlea. It looks like a snail shell. There's an organ inside of this cochlea called the organ of Corti. In that organ of Corti, you find hair cells. Hair cells have these stereocilia on them, and when the fluid moves, now I'm simplifying this, but when the fluid moves, those hair cells are going to deflect certain ways. And when they deflect certain ways, that's going to cause, ultimately, action potentials to leave through the vestibular cochlear nerve, specifically through the cochlear branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve. All right, so let's talk about auditory information first. So once these hair cells are stimulated and cause action potentials to be sent along the cochlear branch of the vestibular cochlear nerve, that's going to come in through. So now we're at the brainstem. Here's cranial nerve number 8, which is located near the pons. So this is auditory information. It's going to enter in through the pons. Well, we need to get it to the cerebral cortex. It can't just jump straight there. It's got to travel through the structures in between. So it goes up to the midbrain. Here's a sagittal section. Up through the midbrain, there's a structure in the midbrain related to auditory information, the inferior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina. Now, if this auditory information warrants a reflex, this is the part that will do it. All right, so if it warrants a reflex, you'll turn your head in the direction of the sound. After that point, then that auditory information, it's a type of sensory information, it's going to be sent to the thalamus. So this is the structure of the diencephalon. The thalamus is going to receive that sensory information and decide what it is. It knows that it's auditory, and so the thalamus will send it to the temporal lobe. When you think temporal lobe, you think auditory. Okay? It's first going to go to the primary auditory cortex just to receive that sensory information. But we're not going to understand what it is we're hearing until that information gets sent to the auditory association, okay? In the auditory association of the temporal lobe, then what that will, it will integrate it, analyze it, and decide what it means, right? So that we can actually understand what it is that we're hearing. Now, if what we're hearing is language related and we have to understand written or like auditory language, then it will go to the Wernicke's area, which is a functional area, kind of temporal and parietal, so that we can understand the language it is that we're hearing, the language we're hearing. All right, so then let's talk about the equilibrium and balance structures of the inner ear. This big chunky piece right here, labeled number 13, this is the vestibule. There are two structures in here oriented like in a horizontal and a vertical plane. They're going to pick up on linear acceleration and movements due to gravity. The semicircular canals, these guys are oriented in 3 planes, so like 3 dimensions. And these guys will help recognize angular acceleration. And so rotational movements. So in your head, if you're nodding yes or nodding no, or lateral flexion of the head to either side, the semicircular canals will pick up on that type of movement, equilibrium and balance information. Ultimately, any type of acceleration or rotational movement, that is going to also cause hair cells in these structures to deflect, which ultimately causes action potentials to be sent along the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. That sensory information will go to multiple places, one major place being the cerebellum, because the cerebellum is kind of our place in space. Structure of the brain helps with motor error corrections, as well as understanding our position in our environment, as well as that information would go up to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe as well. And so that's the ear.